I was 23 years old, 27 weeks pregnant, already raising a 6-year-old, and sitting under studio lights while someone tried to make sense of my life faster than I ever had. From the outside, the story looked obvious. I was young, recently out of rehab, pregnant again, carrying heavy debt, and trying to explain a life that had become increasingly difficult to defend. What I did not fully understand at the time was that my problems were no longer isolated. They had started forming a structure. The most visible fact was the pregnancy. I had gotten pregnant about 2 weeks after leaving rehab. I left rehab in August, and by the time of the interview I was 6 months pregnant and due near the end of May. I already had one child, a son I conceived at 16 and delivered at 17. That first pregnancy had shaped almost everything that came after it. I became a mother before I had any stable adult framework for money, work, housing, or relationships, and that fact continued to shape the rest of my life long after the pregnancy itself stopped being the central event. My first son's biological father was not the man who ended up functioning as his father. The biological father was close to my age, and I found out he was using drugs before I knew I was pregnant. I left him. Later, another man came into my life and became the father figure my son actually grew up with. He was not the biological father, but he was the man who stayed in the picture. He was the man helping to raise my son, and at one point I admitted plainly that without him I probably would not have been able to take care of my child at all. Even before the current pregnancy, my life was already depending on borrowed stability. That is an uncomfortable thing to say clearly, but it is important. I did not build a stable life and then lose it. Large parts of my life were already being held up by other people carrying more than I could. Some of them loved me. Some of them rescued me. Some of them stepped into roles they probably never expected to fill. At the time, that still felt like surviving. I did not yet see how much of my life depended on rescue rather than structure. Then there was my current boyfriend, the father of the baby I was carrying. The clean version of that story would have been simple. I met someone new, we got serious, and we made a reckless decision too soon after rehab. That is not what happened. My current boyfriend was my ex's brother. Before I got with him, I had been involved with his brother. There was also a wife in the picture. At one point, I described a period when my current boyfriend and I started messing around. The wife found out, and the situation briefly turned into what I called a throuple. The details were confusing even while I was trying to explain them. The interviewer needed a whiteboard just to follow who had been with whom and when. That confusion was not only embarrassing. It mattered because it showed how little time anything in my life had to settle before the next consequence arrived. One relationship had not ended clearly before another one started. One man had not left the picture before his brother became the next central person in my life. One child's stability had not fully formed before another pregnancy entered the story. I kept moving, and the movement itself began to look to me like a kind of progress. It was not. It was simply continuous instability. The addiction made everything worse, but even that needs to be stated carefully. The more recent spiral began in April 2025. It started with Adderall and escalated into harder stimulant use. By my own account, the use became severe, reaching somewhere between 1 and 3 grams a day. When I was asked how I paid for it, the answer was simple and ugly. I spent all the money I had and then I started pulling cash advances. The debt was not just the result of poor budgeting. Some of it was directly tied to addiction burning through both present money and future money at the same time. There was no clean line after rehab. I had been sober from opioids for almost a year, but I also relapsed on other drugs. At one point in the interview, I said I was 28 days sober. Elsewhere, I said I was around 339 days sober from opioids. Both statements were true in different ways. I had stopped one category of substances, relapsed into another, and was still trying to present myself as someone in recovery rather than someone still moving through an unstable and fragmented version of it. That distinction mattered to me a great deal at the time, even though the reality underneath it was much less settled than I wanted it to sound. The financial side of the story is where the disorder stopped sounding emotional and became measurable. I had about $103,000 in debt. Most of that was my mortgage, roughly $77,000. A mortgage alone would not have meant much. The problem was that I was far behind. The interview established that I was 5 months delinquent, effectively behind since September, and close enough to foreclosure for it to be part of the immediate conversation. Utilities were also behind by around $2,000 in total. There was credit card debt, some of it worsened by cash advances. There was also a car that needed about $1,500 in repairs at exactly the moment when the household depended on that car to generate income. The car was a bigger issue than it first sounded like. If the car worked, I could do DoorDash. If the car worked, my boyfriend could do DoorDash. We were effectively depending on one vehicle to support both adults in the house. Once that car broke down, the entire income strategy stalled. That is what made the situation structurally fragile. It was not just that money was tight. It was that one mechanical failure could cut off almost the only income stream the household had. At the time, I kept saying I had a plan. The plan was the tax refund. I believed the refund would fix the car, catch up the mortgage, help with utilities, and stabilize the immediate situation. But once the numbers were laid out side by side, it was obvious that the same money was already being asked to solve too many urgent problems at once. Mortgage arrears, utilities, transportation, food, and ordinary living expenses were all waiting for the same check. That was not really a plan. It was a hope attached to one incoming payment. The mortgage made the whole thing heavier because a late mortgage is not just another unpaid bill. It means the roof is part of the crisis. By that point, I was 6 months pregnant, already raising one child, and living in a house that was months behind. That changed the story from one of personal instability to one of household instability. The consequences were no longer only mine. My boyfriend made that worse, not because he was the only problem, but because he was too weak a piece to carry the weight that was already on the table. He already had children of his own and was now expecting another with me. When the interviewer tried to bring him into the conversation by phone, he defended himself briefly and then pulled back. I defended him in the moment. I said he was trying. I said he was not a failure. But the transcript makes clear that he had no stable formal job in months beyond DoorDash, and even that work depended on the same broken vehicle. I was asking a man with no real structure underneath him to help support a household that was already failing in several directions at once. That is one of the hardest truths in the story. I wanted to believe there was still time for him to become the version of himself I needed. I wanted to believe that fatherhood would make him more serious, that the baby would force clarity, that we were just in a bad stretch. But mortgages, utilities, and pregnancies do not wait for a man to become ready. Bills do not wait. Children do not wait. My life was full of people who were trying. What it lacked was enough people who were actually carrying. My parents were still carrying more than I wanted to admit. During the interview, I said they were willing to help me catch up the mortgage. They had apparently helped before as well, and I framed it as temporary help that I would repay once the refund arrived. That detail matters because it explains how a life like mine keeps going. It does not keep going because it is stable. It keeps going because someone always steps in just before the next collapse becomes final. My ex helped with my first son. Public assistance helped with food. My parents were the backstop against foreclosure. The refund was supposed to rescue the car. My boyfriend was supposed to grow into the role I needed him to fill. The supports were real, but none of them changed the basic structure underneath them. That is one of the most important things I can say now. I thought those supports meant I was surviving. What they really meant was that collapse kept being postponed just long enough for me to keep describing it as temporary. The pregnancy itself got absorbed into that same thinking. I said this baby would be my last. I said he would get fixed. I said things were different now. I said I knew what I was doing. Listening back, Those lines sound less like confidence than like someone trying to force a sense of order onto consequences that had already arrived. Once I was pregnant, I spoke as if intention could clean up timing. Once I was living with him, I spoke as if commitment could erase pattern. Once I was behind on the house, I spoke as if a refund could substitute for stability. That is how denial often sounds in adult life. It does not sound insane from the inside. Sounds like trying to remain functional. The substance use during pregnancy was where that logic became hardest to defend. I said I vaped nicotine. I said my doctors knew. I also said I used THC concentrate and described it as part of staying California sober, rather than relapsing into harder substances. The interviewer responded by citing public health risks. I kept returning to the same basic defense. The doctors knew, the scans looked fine, and what I was doing felt less dangerous than the relapse I feared. The larger point is not who won that argument in the room. The larger point is the logic I was living by. I was no longer describing what was good or safe. I was describing what felt less catastrophic than the alternative I feared. That same logic was running through the rest of my life. DoorDash was not stable, but it was what we had. The house was unaffordable, but losing it would be worse. My boyfriend was unreliable, but he was there. The taxes were uncertain, but they were the plan. My parents' money was humiliating, but foreclosure was worse. The substances were dangerous, but relapse seemed more dangerous. That is not stability. It is damage management. The children are what make the story impossible to hear lightly. My first son was already living inside a structure where fatherhood, money, and emotional security depended on whichever adult happened to be most functional in that season. The second child was being carried through 5 months of mortgage delinquency, utility arrears, uncertain income, public assistance, unstable recovery, and a house in which the father was still being defended more than he was actually carrying. Whatever I told myself about it, the children were already living inside the structure that remained when my explanations were over. At one point in the interview, I said I had been good before. I said I once had $18,000 saved. I said I bought a house at 22. Those details were not meaningless. They were the parts of my life I kept reaching for when I wanted to prove to myself as much as anyone else that I was not always this unstable. But I think those facts mattered to me then mostly because they kept me from having to admit how unstable I had become. They were fragments of self-respect I used to resist the full meaning of the present. That may be the most honest thing I can say now. I was not only living in chaos, I was also defending it. Not proudly and not openly, but every time I said I had a plan, every time I said he was trying, every time I said the baby was fine, every time I said the refund was coming, every time I said this was my last child, I was doing the same thing. I was trying to keep the word temporary alive in a life that had already started organizing itself as continuous emergency. That is why the story is not best understood as a spectacle. It is a story about what adult collapse looks like before the person living it is willing to call it collapse. It is messy, improvised, half-funded, dependent on rescue, full of explanations that each sound plausible by themselves and almost impossible together. It is rarely one huge moment. It is the accumulation of one unfinished consequence after another, until the person in the middle of it begins to mistake continued survival for stability. A younger audience may hear the scandal first. The ex's brother. The cheating. The rehab timeline. The shouting. The public humiliation of the interview. An older audience hears the mortgage. The one car. The months behind. The parents stepping in again. The first child already depending on a non-biological father figure for structure. The second child arriving before the current household has shown it can support one responsibly. That is not internet chaos. It is a family system under mechanical stress. The most troubling part is not that so many things had gone wrong. It is that, by then, a lot of it no longer sounded fully abnormal to me. Not the debt. Not the drifting men. Not the late mortgage. Not the public assistance. Not the help from my parents. Not the substance use during pregnancy. Not the idea of bringing another child into it. That is the real danger in a life like this. It is not only what goes wrong. It is what starts feeling ordinary after enough time. Person can survive a chaotic year. Person can survive addiction. A person can survive one terrible relationship or one financial collapse. What becomes much harder to survive is the moment when chaos stops feeling like a crisis and starts feeling like the climate of the whole life. That is when unstable choices begin to look normal, rescues begin to look routine, and every new consequence gets folded into the same old language about trying, planning, and getting through one more month. That was the real story. Not that I had made bad choices. Not that the room was hostile. Not that the interview was humiliating. The real story was that my life had become a system that ran on delayed consequences, outside rescue, unstable men, and whatever explanation I needed to keep from naming the pattern for what it was. If there is one line that stays with me now, it is this. I was not only afraid of losing the house. I was afraid that if I stopped talking about my life like it was one bad season, I would have to admit that my children were no longer just passing through my instability. They were already being raised inside it.